Hello, and welcome to today's ACM Tech Talk. This webcast is part of ACM's commitment to lifelong learning and professional development, serving a global membership of computing professionals and students. I'm Will Trace, Lockheed Martin Fellow Emeritus, former chair of ACM SIGSOC, and a member of the ACM Professional Development Committee. For more on my background, see the bio widget on your screen. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with ACM or what it has to offer, here's more information. ACM offers educational and professional development resources that bolster skills and enhance career opportunities. Our members can stay competitive in a constantly changing world of computing with a range of ACM Learning Center resources at learning.acm.org. You can see more of the highlights on your screen. ACM recognizes the role of computing in driving the innovations that sustain competitiveness in the global environment. ACM provides access to the ACM Digital Library, the world's most comprehensive database on computing literature, leading publications and global conferences that draw top experts on a broad spectrum of computing topics, support for education and research, including curriculum development, teacher training, and ACM training and ACM Prize in Computing awards. And, importantly, the ACM Code of Ethics, a collection of principles and guidelines designed to help computing professionals make ethically responsible decisions in professional practice. ACM enables its members to solve critical problems using new technology that enriches our lives and advances our society in the digital age. Before we get started, and for those joining us for the first time, I'd like to quickly mention a few housekeeping items shown on the slide in front of you now. If you are experiencing problems with the slides or audio, refresh your browser or close and relaunch the presentation. If you have questions during the talk, please type them into the Q&A box at any time and click the submit button. I, as the moderator, will organize the questions as Paul speaks, and we'll try to get to them as many as possible. This session is being recorded and will be archived. You will receive an automatic email notification when it becomes available. And please check learning.acm.org for updates on this and other upcoming webcasts. At the end of the presentation, you'll see a survey open on your screen. Please take a minute to fill it out and help us improve our Tech Talks. You may open the link to the survey at any time from the resource window. You can also use the widgets at the bottom panel to share a presentation link with your friends, as well as tweet comments and questions using the hashtag #ACMLearning. We'll be watching for your tweets. We also have a community discourse page that some of you have already taken advantage of to continue the discussion after this webcast, including questions we'll be able to get to through the Q&A session. Today's presentation, an industry perspective on what we should be teaching our next generation of software practitioners in the universities, by Paul McMahon. Paul McMahon is principal consultant at TEM Systems, where he has been coaching large and small teams in practical approaches to increase agility for the last 20 years. Prior to his independent coaching, Paul spent 25 years working as a software development in the U.S. defense industry. Paul recently released his 7th technical book, Shy Boys, Notes from 10 Years of Working with Software Engineering Giants. He is an ACM member. Paul, without further ado, take it away.
Okay, I'm going to my first slide. First of all, thanks, Will. Let me start by thanking Will Trace for agreeing to moderate this session. And let me just say before getting started that this is a new talk, but in the talk I'll be referring to a number of previous presentations and publications. So for those interested in digging deeper into this topic, I give a list of references at the end. I'll also be referring to the Essence framework. And so for those of you who are not familiar with that, I'll explain what you need to know about Essence at the appropriate time. So now let's get into it. Dr. Pekka Abramson, a software engineering professor, observed in a recent meeting with a number of his colleagues that what we've been traditionally teaching our future software engineers in the university is significantly different from what practitioners often experience in the real world. And he specifically said that we don't teach students how to build their own method. So while I agree with Dr. Abramson, what occurred to me while listening to him is the fact that when students leave the university and go into industry, most of them won't be asked to build their own method anyway, but rather they will be asked to learn and use whatever method is currently in use in the company they have chosen to work in. It could be Agile, or it could be Agile at scale, or it could be waterfall. But what also hit me was that even if we teach these methods in the university, those students are in for a big surprise when they go into industry, because the fact is that every company's method, whether it's called Agile or Agile at scale or waterfall, is different. So the first challenge new software engineering graduates will face when they leave the university and go into industry will be to learn what I like to refer to as the expected way of working in their chosen organization. But equally important, they will be asked to help improve that expected way of working. So the first practical thing I believe we should be teaching our next generation of software practitioners is how to improve an existing method, regardless of what that method is. A perfect example of this is the common retrospective practice we see in many Agile and Agile at scale organizations. Given this fact, I want to now focus on how we could be teaching students to improve any method. And to explain this, I'm going to use parts of the Essence framework, specifically the Essence checklists. So now, for those unfamiliar, I want to give you a little background on Essence. Essence became an object management group standard in 2014, and its current version, 1.2, was released in 2018. Essence is a kernel and language for software engineering methods. It is not a method itself, but rather it is a common ground of essentials that underlie all methods. And I cannot stress this point enough, because as you're going to see when I get into the examples, this point is critical to the goal at hand. Now, a little more about Essence. Essence contains 7 alphas. Just think of alphas as the most important things we work with on all software engineering endeavors. And they always exist no matter how simple or complex the software endeavor. Examples are requirements or stakeholders. Each alpha has 5 or 6 states. But what often doesn't get the attention it deserves are the checklists that characterize each state. And that is what I want to focus on in this talk. I will be giving you multiple concrete examples that demonstrate how key Essence checklists can be used to help bridge the gap that Dr. Abramson referred to between what we are currently teaching in the universities and what new graduates often face when they go into industry. Okay, now a little of my background of myself. In my work with industry clients, going back before the development of Essence, I've often encouraged developers to share with their peers their own stories related to challenges faced and solutions that worked for them. The Essence checklists were developed by volunteers, including people from industry, academia, and research. I was one of those volunteers from industry. And when we developed the checklists, I shared many stories from my own experiences, as well as stories shared with me by my clients. And the other volunteers shared many of their own stories from their experiences. As a result, many of these stories from real industry experiences provided the genesis for a number of the checklists that are now in the Essence standard. And I highlight the fact in red on this slide because it is important to understand these checklists are not an unproven theory. So now let me just share a few of the guidelines we used in transforming these real-life stories into many of the Essence checklists. And this is important because it will help you understand how to effectively use them. First, we used natural language. We didn't want to introduce any new terms, and this was true of both the checklists and the other elements of the framework. Alpha was one of the few new terms, and we selected it because something new was going on here, and we didn't want to use an existing term that carried baggage and may give the wrong meaning. Two, not check-the-box checklists. To accomplish this, we used words and phrases in the checklist that encourage conversation. Examples are phrases such as agreed to and sufficient. These phrases were intentionally chosen to elicit conversation. Now, a natural question many ask when they first see these phrases are, agreed to by who? And how do I know how much is sufficient? The answer to these questions is that each team has to determine what these phrases mean given their own context. And this is part of what needs to go on in the conversation. And as you're going to see in the classroom as well. And lastly, we wanted to create checklists that help teams focus on achieving the goal of a practice rather than just complying with a process. And I'm going to provide a specific example shortly that demonstrates how this guideline is achieved. Okay, so where are we headed now? I will now give you a number of concrete examples by sharing stories that demonstrate how these checklists can be used by software teams in industry. And just to be clear, what we're really talking about here is teaching future software developers how to conduct a root cause analysis of a problem to aid in arriving at an optimum solution. This is what's needed to improve any process, or method. And this is what developers are certain to be asked to do, regardless of what company they go into, large or small, and regardless of what method that company is using. So now here are a few common challenges we often see in industry. We're always dealing with unclear requirements. I hear this all the time. We can't get our stakeholders to work with us. The hardware is always late, and management ends up cutting the test time. So let me just make one point here before we dig into a few of these common situations. I referred earlier to a meeting of software engineering professors. This regular meeting is called the Essence Education Forum. At one recent meeting, I heard from one university professor that we give students a set of requirements and ask them to develop software to meet those requirements. But I also heard these students often don't have real stakeholders, and we don't give them ambiguous requirements. This is a perfect example of what Dr. Abramson was referring to when he talked about a gap between what we are teaching and what the students will experience in industry. We know these types of common problematic situations that occur frequently in industry. As I just listed a few, we know what students will face. They're going to face similar challenges when they leave the university. So when we give students a problem to solve in school where they don't have to face difficult stakeholders or ambiguous requirements, we're not doing the best possible job to really prepare them for the kinds of real challenges we know they are going to face when they go into industry. This is what we're trying to fix. Now, some real examples. I'll start with an actual case study from one of my own clients, demonstrating how I use Essence in industry. And while professors may not have this situation in the classroom, I believe these kinds of scenarios can be used as a classroom teaching aid just by presenting these kinds of stories. I have referred to the approach I'm going to show you as using Essence in stealth mode. And I will explain why I use it this way as we get into it. As I said earlier, the checklists are worded in a way that encourages conversation. And so the following is an example of a conversation I had with one of my clients. As you can see in bubble 1, my client starts the conversation by saying, let me explain the problem we have. Our two key customers use our system differently. As I listen, my client's words trigger two alphas in the back of my head. You can see them in bubble 2. Stakeholders and software system. The conversation continues, as you see in bubble 3, with my client saying, often when we get focused on changes for one, we break critical functionality for the other. This causes me to drill down in my head on a couple of checklists in those alphas, as you see in bubble 4. System functionality tested and defect levels acceptable. Eventually, the conversation leads us to a root cause and an agreed to solution. Oh, I think my slide jumped ahead there. Okay. So what I want you to take from this is the fact that it's just a conversation using natural words that can help guide teams to find their own effective solution or guide students my slide just jumped ahead again on me. So, okay. Or to guide students to understand what they will face in industry. So next, I want to go a little deeper into this example to demonstrate how software developers can use this approach on their own without a consultant such as myself. And this is important because my job as a consultant is to work myself out of a job as fast as I can so the team can be successful on their own. In other words, they need to be able to have the conversation without me or another consultant. So to understand this case, I first need to explain a little bit about the services I provide. One of the services I provide to clients is teaching Scrum and then coaching the team as the project proceeds through its first few sprints. I use Essence when I do this, and the reason gets back to my point that everyone's Agile is different. And because everyone's tailors Scrum, I want to make sure my client understands the goal of each practice. You're going to see an example of this in a moment. So I am not the only one who uses Essence when teaching Scrum. Jeff Sutherland, the co-founder of Scrum, also uses Essence when he teaches Scrum. And he has made the point that in his experience, only 1/3 of Scrum practices are implemented well. Another 1/3 are implemented poorly, and the last third aren't implemented at all. Jeff has actually stated that Essence is the path to success with Scrum. And I personally believe Essence can help teams stay on the path to success with any method because of its focus on the goal. Now, getting back to that client I had that said their 2 key customers use their product differently. I had taught this client Scrum, and I was coaching them through their first few sprints and coaching their Scrum Master. They were making changes that could affect the way those 2 key customers use the product. They learned one of those key customers could not make it to a sprint review. When this happened, the team immediately went into a brainstorming mode. And rather than just go through the motions of holding the sprint review, the product owner got on a plane and took the product to that key customer's site, where he demonstrated the results of the team's effort on the latest sprint. From that review, the team received valuable feedback that helped them avoid what could have been a serious problem for that customer in the next release. This is an actual example where not going through the motions of a practice made sense because the team knew that the real goal of the sprint review was to get stakeholder feedback, not just go through the motions of a sprint review. When I taught them the sprint review practice, I emphasized the goal of that practice was to get key stakeholder feedback, not just hold a meeting called a sprint review. If you look at the Essence stakeholder alpha involved state, there is a checklist here that says timely feedback and decisions provided. That checklist item I use to help teams focus on the goal. And professors can do the same thing in the classroom. By the way, what you are seeing here is referred to as an alpha state card. You'll see many more as I progress, and you can download your own set for free from the CMAT website, and you'll find that URL at the end of my presentation. You also see...
Paul, yep. I hate to interrupt you, but we're experiencing some technical difficulties with the audio. So I'm just going to break in and describe in the chat window. You'll get more information exactly what we think is causing some distracted clicks. So I apologize to all those in attendance that I'll try to iron this out. And yeah, in the meantime, we'll carry on. Thanks, Paul.
Are you hearing me all right, Will?
I'm hearing you, but there's background noise, like your computer microphone is picking up the mouse clicks or your chair is creaking, or I know you're not typing anything, but it sure sounds like there's keyboard clicks.
Okay, I will try to stay still.
You can try to stay still. I mean, the only option is you pick up your cell phone and call in, and then, yeah. But anyway, let's just stay still. And once again, I apologize to those in attendance. We'll address this issue the best we can. Okay. Back to you, Paul.
All right. So getting back to the start of this site, if you look at the, well, let me just continue from where I was. You also see here one of those words that I referred to earlier that needs to be interpreted by the team, timely. The team needs to decide what timely means to them given their situation. And they did. They agreed they had to get the feedback from the key customer before the next release to ensure their repeating problem of breaking functionality for a key customer didn't happen. This is an example that shows how a checklist, when used appropriately, can help teams focus on the goal rather than compliance with a process. They knew that if they just went through the motions of holding the sprint review without that key stakeholder, they were at risk of not meeting the real goal of the sprint review. This is a great example that could be taught to students in the classroom to help prepare them for industry. I'm going to take just a quick break and take a gulp of water.
With that said, I encourage you to, the attendees, to take advantage of this little time to submit a question. We've got plenty of questions coming in, but this is once again a reminder, please, if you have a question, use the Q&A window to submit it. Thank you.
There's another checklist I want to mention here. Stakeholders Alpha, in agreement state, checklist, priorities clear and perspectives balanced. Some people, when they first see the stakeholder Alpha in agreement state, say that it's not realistic. They point out that in the real world, you can't always get all your stakeholders in agreement, and they're absolutely correct. But this comment is an example of why you need to understand the checklists that characterize each state. We're not saying that all the stakeholders must all be in complete agreement to achieve this state. What we are saying is that key stakeholders agree that the priorities are clear and perspectives are being balanced. Those words in that checklist were carefully chosen. Sometimes when you can't give all your stakeholders what ideally they want, you need to explain to them and be transparent about the challenge you face and show them how you are balancing their needs. Maybe you say, we can't get everything this release, but here is our plan to get what you need and by when. Again, this is the real world, and students can be taught this. This is what happens in the real world, so when they go into industry, they don't get a big surprise. Next, I want to give you another example that shows how the checklists are independent of method, which is great for teaching in the university students, because when in the university, we don't yet know what method will be employed by the company the student ends up working for. This example will also demonstrate why we need to be teaching students in the university how to apply these checklists appropriately using context. I gave a keynote presentation in November last year at the first international workshop on Essence in education and training, conducted in conjunction with the 32nd IEEE International Conference on Software Engineering. And in that workshop, there was a very interesting discussion that was initiated by a participant who had industry experience but was new to Essence. This participant was making an argument against Essence because he felt that the framework sounded like a new method and it would confuse students when we tried to teach them one of today's popular methods, such as Scrum. In the conference, the specific challenge we heard related to the use of the word fully in the checklist item system fully documented within the software system alpha usable state. The conference participant indicated that he felt the checklist was requiring traditional heavyweight documentation, which was inconsistent with today's popular Agile approaches. This is an example of a word used in the Essence framework that each team needs to interpret given their own context. Specifically, here the relevant context is the endeavors agreed to practices. If your practices are lightweight and your agreed to practices include lightweight documentation, then fully documented means lightweight documentation, not heavyweight documentation. In other words, fully must be interpreted within the context of your agreed practices. But I also want to point out that it does not mean no documentation, even in organizations that have agreed to very light practices. Once you understand this way of thinking, you should be able to understand how these checklists can be used with any method. The words and phrases in the checklists were chosen with the intent of minimizing baggage tied to specific methods. But there's no perfect words, and as we saw with the word fully, words can always be misinterpreted, and so the intent and how to use these checklists need to be taught to students and new software developers. And the best way I have found to do this is through concrete examples, in particular actual stories from industry, such as those that I'm giving you now. And if you're interested in more information on this example, on the last slide of my presentation, I share where in the conference video you can find this discussion, as well as other referenced discussions. Now, as another example, the requirements alpha coherence state has a checklist that is worded, conflicting requirements are identified and attended to. Note that the card has an abbreviated version of the full checklist item that I have spelled out on the slide. Note also that the checklist is not telling you how to go about doing this. You may use the backlog grooming practice, as many Agile organizations do, but you may also use a different practice. In fact, in organizations that use more traditional waterfall approaches, some have a distinct group responsible for developing requirements, and they may use a more traditional requirements review practice to ensure that requirements are not conflicting and they are ready to be worked on by the development team. New developers, when they leave the university, if all they have learned is the backlog grooming practice in order to ensure conflicting requirements are identified and attended to, could be in for a big surprise if they don't go to an organization that uses Scrum or some other Agile variant. On the other hand, if we teach them the goal and then show them one or two practices, such as backlog grooming, to demonstrate one way to achieve this goal, but make it clear to them this is not the only way, then they will be better prepared when they go into industry, regardless of the way of working of that organization. This will also help them be better prepared if they go to one company and then after a few years leave that company and take a job somewhere else with possibly a very different culture and different way of working. Keep in mind that moving from one company to another is much more common today for many software developers than it was years ago. Now let's get into another example. Again, going back to that Essence workshop I referred to, we also heard a great discussion related to how requirements are not always requirements. To a student in a university, this discussion would have probably been very confusing. Why would a requirement sometimes not be a requirement? Sounds like a contradiction. This point was brought up by someone with real industry experience. So let me explain the point he was getting at now. Requirements are one of the Essence 7 alphas because requirements always exist on all software endeavors. They may be documented or not, but in either case, they still exist. If they're documented, it might be in the form of user stories or use cases or English language or possibly some other format. This depends on the organization's chosen requirements practice. While, as I have said, this is why it's not part of Essence, because practices can vary. But what doesn't vary is the fact that all teams and stakeholders learn things as they go. And often they realize that not all that they thought were requirements at the start of the endeavor turn out to be really required to meet the user's needs. This is because as they learn more about the system being built or modified, they often figure out new ways to achieve the intent of some of those things they thought were requirements. And they also learn that there may be other things they missed at the beginning that really are requirements, but were not captured using their requirements practice or tool. As a result, by the end of a project, often there is a negotiation and agreements to trade off certain items they thought were requirements at the start for some possible enhancements that never were requirements in the first place. This is the real world. To account for this real-world situation, we have a checklist in essence that says enough addressed to be acceptable. And I just gave you a story that explains why this checklist is so important in the real world of industry. And again, students should be taught this because it is the way the real world of industry operates. And they shouldn't be surprised to find this when they leave the university and go into industry. So now let me give you another great stakeholder story. This is one I usually tell in my own Essence training. Let's start this story with the definition of a stakeholder alpha. This is another type of card referred to as the alpha definition card. When you download the full set, you'll also get these cards. Stakeholders are the people, groups, or organizations who affect or are affected by a software system. Sometimes we forget that stakeholders aren't just those who are affected, but also those who can affect a software system. For this reason, I refer to this story as my stakeholders need a stake scenario. This is an actual situation that happened with one of my clients. This client was dependent on getting critical data from a specific stakeholder organization, but they ran into all kinds of trouble trying to figure out who to talk to in the organization to get the data. It just wasn't a priority for this agency because they weren't actually affected by the software system being developed. In other words, they didn't have a stake in the game. This happens all the time in the real world when teams don't understand the essentials of stakeholder management. This is why we have specific checklists in the stakeholder alpha to ensure that not only key stakeholder groups are identified, but they're also represented, and those representatives are involved, assisting the team in a timely way. What I want you to understand here is that university students can understand these kinds of real stories and should hear them before they leave the university and go into industry. But even more important, we can share ideas and tips with students on how to resolve these kinds of common problems or avoid them in the first place, so the students are better prepared to help their organization on day one when they start their first job in industry. As just one quick example of a tip I got from one of my clients when he heard this situation described, he said what his company always does is write a penalty clause into the contract when they know they have a dependency on customer data. That ensures the stakeholder with the data always has a stake in the game. By sharing examples like this, students can be better prepared to help their organization on day one. Now let me give you another example that demonstrates the importance of teaching students how to effectively apply checklists to aid critical thinking. This example is from an actual program I was involved with. A team of highly educated, experienced personnel representing the customer were assisting a contractor's readiness they were assessing a contractor's readiness to move forward to the next phase of a major program. They had 150 checklists they were using in their assessment. And just to be clear, I'm not talking about Essence checklists now. They were very specific checklists they had come up with based on their own program. I should also point out now that we do expect teams to add their own specific checklists, as this project did, based on their own situation or team weaknesses. Now, let me get back to the story here. After analyzing the necessary data to evaluate each checklist, The team reached the decision that the project should be given the okay to proceed because they met 140 out of the 150 checklist items. The problem was that one of those 10 checklist items the contractor failed to meet was having a sound architecture that would meet the customer's needs. This is a perfect example of how very experienced people with advanced degrees can fail to understand the basics of critical thinking and the use of checklists in a sound and appropriate way. The point that everyone should take from this is that specifically about using any checklist, not just the essence checklist, is that all checklists don't carry the same weight. You have to use checklists in a critical thinking capacity. And to do this, you have to understand your context to determine which checklists may be critical to success in your situation and which may require little attention. A sound architecture is clearly critical to success of any software endeavor, and therefore failing even one such critical checklist item should be seen as sufficient to fail the project assessment. This is a key part of what I am suggesting we need to be teaching our next generation of software practitioners. That is how to be good critical thinkers. The checklists from the Essence framework can be viewed as a practical tool that can help us teach this important way of thinking. In fact, I would like to add at this point that if you go back and think about all the examples I've given you in the talk, they all relate to understanding context and teaching students how to be effective critical thinkers. Now, I want to move this talk in a slightly different direction. Alistair Cockburn, one of the authors of the Agile Manifesto, has started a new initiative referred to as the Heart of Agile. Cockburn's motivation for starting this movement is based on his belief that Agile has become overly decorated and we have lost appropriate attention on the human and cultural side of software development. In a recent interview with Richard Atherton in April 2019, when talking about his Heart of Agile initiative, Cockburn said, "We are trying to create a culture of listening. If our tone is dialogue-based, people will self-include and exclude. Today, more and more people in the world are growing up in dialogue rather than edict." Now let me tie this back to what we should be teaching in the universities. The Essence framework has a checklist item in the Team Alpha collaboration state related to this point. It reads, "Communication is open and honest." There was a lot of discussion by the Essence volunteers as to whether this checklist item should be included in the framework because there were differing opinions as to whether open and honest communication is in fact essential for software endeavor success. While I agree with Cockburn that more and more people in the world are growing up in dialogue, the fact is that there are still organizations with strong cultures where team members are expected to just follow the rules and open and honest communication is not necessarily encouraged. And to be honest, some of these organizations are still successful. I know this because I've recently been inside a few of these organizations and I hear what is going on from my clients. The point is, there isn't just one single answer when it comes to communication models. And by sharing with our students stories of different types of organizations with differing communication methods and related cultures, those students will be better prepared for whatever they encounter when they go into industry. Furthermore, by knowing these different styles and cultures exist, and this also implies varying principles and values inside these companies, it can help our students be students in their own decision-making process when it comes to just what type of organization they want to work in. Now I want to say a little more about principles and values. particularly in regard to stakeholder trust in software applications when it comes to key attributes such as safety, security, and privacy. Today, a very hot topic is cybersecurity. If you step back and think about it, any system can be hacked in two fundamentally different ways: by breaking in from the outside or using existing channels, such as routine software updates from dependent software suppliers or trusted insiders. A trusted insider could be any software programmer inside the organization. But to be confident that our next generation of software developers are truly trustworthy, we need to ensure they have been trained in and accept their responsibilities, which include living the values and principles agreed to by the team and the stakeholders. So now let me say more about agreed to principles and how this is handled by the Essence framework. I mentioned in the start of this talk that when students leave the university and go into industry, they will be asked to learn the expected way of working within their chosen organization. The first state of the Essence way of working alpha is principles established. This state was chosen because the volunteers recognized that principles need to precede practices. In other words, a team's practices need to be built on an agreed to set of principles, and those principles must be based on the team and the stakeholders' values. Two of the checklists in that first state of the way of working alpha are team actively supports principles and the stakeholders agree with the principles. Underlying these checklists is the assumption of an agreed to set of common values. This raises a very interesting question. We know throughout the world there are many varying cultures and value systems, but are there a set of values we can all agree to that transcends our differences? I don't believe there is universal agreement on this today, but we do know that when teams are assembled with a goal to create or modify a software product, to be successful, they need to work as one unit and stay focused on their mission. These are, in fact, two of the Essence checklists in the Team Alpha collaborating state. It is important that I point out here that Essence doesn't tell teams what their principles or values need to be, but it does let teams and stakeholders know that identifying and agreeing to a well-defined set of principles and values is essential for endeavor success. I should also add here that one of the reasons you won't find specific values and principles in Essence goes back to the fact that Essence is a common ground that always exists on all successful software endeavors. Each team, along with its stakeholders, needs to examine their own situation to determine what principles and values are most critical, and those decisions should be based on risk. So now let me say a little more about risk and critical thinking. Some have asked, why isn't risk an alpha, since risk always exists? The simple answer is because all of the alphas and states can be viewed like a risk indicator dashboard. Risk means uncertainty, and uncertainty means a need to balance trade-offs. This is why critical thinking skills are so essential for our future software developers. It is also important to point out here that teaching our students the fundamentals of critical thinking isn't something that will stick if it is only emphasized in a single software engineering course. I have previously suggested in other publications, and I provide a few of those references at the end, that university professors should consider integrating into day-to-day activities as a thinking tool in other computer science courses as well, including cybersecurity, computer ethics, and artificial intelligence machine learning courses. Now let me give you an example that demonstrates critical thinking in the area of cybersecurity and defense. In September 2018, I published a video blog that was titled Cyber Secure Software, New Twists to Well-Known Questions Every Developer Should Be Asking. About 15 minutes into the video, I mentioned that in 2008, Robert Gates, the then Secretary of Defense for the U.S.